you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. What a pleasure it is to welcome you to Kaufman Music Center. I'm Amy Roberts-Frawley. I'm the Managing Director of Merkin Concert Hall here at the center. Kaufman Music Center is a place to explore the arts, primarily music, through performances in this gracious hall and through educational opportunities, including the K-12 Special Music School, Face the Music, which is a program that pairs teens with living composers for actual music making and learning about how the score comes off the page and comes into the instruments, and you actually make the music that the composers are hoping you will. And it's also the home of the Lucy Moses School, which is the city's largest community music school. On the topic of performances, I hope you will return here soon for an evening of the Ecstatic Music Festival. This is a cutting-edge festival. It features one-of-a-kind evenings that pair artists collaborating in the creation of works that cross genres and celebrate the new. One such show is on March 1, and it has the poet and spoken word artist Mahogany L. Brown as its centerpiece, and it joins her with Aaron Dyer's Drone Choir. So please note the promotion either on the back cover of your program, or pick up the brochure on your way out of the hall tonight, or visit ecstatic.com. So Kaufman Music Center is an extremely proud partner in the presentation of TimesTalks. Just last Tuesday, we had Common in conversation with Mark Lacey, which was a truly extraordinary evening. And tonight, we are honored to offer you Angela Davis and Patrisse Cullors in a dialogue with Melissa Harris Perry. So join me in welcoming Michelle Gray of the New York Times to the stage. Thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Gray, the creative director of the New York Times live conversation, performance, and screening series, TimesTalks, which pairs New York Times journalists with the brightest and boldest creative minds from the fields of film, theater, music, art, fashion, science, literature, and social justice. We're thrilled to be welcoming you to tonight's event with Patrisse Khan-Cullors, artist, freedom fighter, and co-founder of Black Lives Matter, and world-renowned activist, academic, and author, Professor Angela Davis. In honor of Black History Month and the release of Cullors' latest book, When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter Memoir, the duo will discuss the continuing violence and racial uprising currently plaguing our country, how we change the culture that declares innocent Black life expendable, and how protest in the interest of the most vulnerable comes from love. Moderating tonight's conversation is television host, award-winning author, political commentator, and contributing writer for the New York Times, Melissa Harris Perry. Just a reminder also that both Professor Davis and Patrisse will be signing books after the talk, so please join them. So without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Melissa Harris Perry, Patrisse Cullors, and Professor Angela Davis.
You should make us work harder. We shouldn't get the standing ovation. Except for one person who's on stage, who absolutely deserves the standing ovation. So, Professor Davis, I want to start with you. I want to start actually by going back to this rather extraordinary interview that you did in 1972. So it's a little bit long, it's 3 minutes, but it's such a valuable text. I think it's worth all of us taking a moment. everything you do in those 3 minutes, reminding us that we don't live for the first time in a moment when those who are in leadership will say words that will cause violence, reminding us that violence is enacted against us, and laughing at the question from the beginning and reframing it. As you look out on the political space and the media space where we are right now, Professor Davis, what are we asking in exactly the wrong way?
Well, I think we're asking a lot of questions that won't elicit the kinds of answers that will move us forward. In many ways, I think we're being too myopic, assuming that the only current task is to get rid of Trump. And of course, we need to get rid of him. But that will certainly not address, all of the burning questions. And when I look at the work that Patrisse and her comrades have done over the last years, urging us to think more deeply about the extent to which racism is embedded in the fabric of this country, urging us to think about structures and apparatuses, and not only about individuals. We tend to assume that that individuals are the problem, and if we just get rid of this racist individual, but we don't ask, what is it that has produced the racism, and why has it been reproduced over and over again, generation after generation? So I'm not going to actually formulate the questions that should be asked, but maybe we'll all do that before the evening is over.
Patrisse, I also want to take about 2 minutes to listen to you speaking, in part because for me, sitting these two interviews next to each other is breathtaking. So I'd like to just take a moment and we'll look at this. It's not that long ago that you gave this interview with Fusion. That both of you, so many decades apart, can tell these stories of state repression, of violence against Black children. Professor Davis wrote the foreword to this book, and she says that the book exists at the productive intersection of personal experiences and political resistance. I felt that in both pieces. Can you reflect on that a bit for me?
Yeah. Can we just take a moment? This is amazing. I'm having a pinch myself moment. I just want to be real honest. I love these two women very much. They've done a lot for me, personally, politically. And when we live in a world that literally from the moment a Black girl is born, that tells us that we don't deserve to live, to have mentors like Melissa and Angela is just really powerful. So I just want to honor who I'm with right now. You know, I think for me, I knew from a very young age the way in which I was living and the community I was living in, it was unacceptable. I knew that we deserved dignity. I knew that we deserved care. I didn't know how we were going to get there as a child. And it wasn't until I joined this movement. But in those early years of my childhood, it was just so much state repression. And I think in a lot of ways up until social media and Black Lives Matter, I think mostly white folks thought Black people were being hyperbolic.
Yep.
That we were exaggerating, that all couldn't have possibly happened. And yet it did. And it happened consistently and strategically and systemically. And I think joining a movement early on in my life and getting the language to understand that actually me being poor and my mother being poor and us being raised in this way wasn't our fault. That there was a plan and a setup. This is what it looked like to live in a capitalist place, country, neighborhood. And that really, I feel blessed that I was able to have the language to identify early on that, oh, I can actually change this. If this is a setup, that I can set it up differently. And that I can build with a team of people, with organization, with collectives, to decide a different fate for myself, for my family and my community members. And I'm forever grateful for that opportunity. And I think this moment that we're living in, this moment under 45 in particular, and this administration offers us collectively a new moment to remind ourselves to keep our eyes on the prize, that there are bigger and bolder goals, right, than just getting 45 out of office.
When you talk about the setup, so that's actually backed up by data. I always feel like it's good to talk about data these days because, you know, some people don't. I mean, this is no problem with having a little evidence. There you go. So you talk about the setup. The first part of the text is really about you with this, I'm going to say this, and I hope Asha is somewhere on Facebook listening to us, but the two of you and your voice together do an almost early Toni Morrison capacity of like giving us the little girl vision of the world, and then your voice coming back with what you then know as an adult, which I think is extremely valuable. So you're experiencing the state repression, but then you're reminding us that as an adult, you recognize that deindustrialization and incarceration go together. So there's this chart I want to show here from the Sentencing Project that will show the setup, right? So this is that one that looks like the big mountain at the end that's red. It'll come. But yes, there it is, right? So this is U.S. state and federal prison population from 1925 to 2015. And there is a baby boom, but it's way before this could happen. And there's just not possible in what we know about sociology, biology, that people would have become inherently that much more criminal.
Exactly.
That swiftly.
Yeah.
So this is a decision. Two questions. First for you. Patrisse, you pose this question to your readers. If prisons are supposed to make society more safe, why do I feel so much fear and hurt? So now I'm posing it to you.
Ooh. Just looking at this chart, I think, you know this, right? I know this data. I have this information. I talk about it often, but to see a chart.
Those are people.
Those are people.
Those are humans.
Those are human beings. Those are a lot of my family members.
And let's also remember that jails aren't even included here.
That's right.
Right.
These are just prisons.
Prisons.
These are just prisons. That's right.
Prison facilities
That's right.
are actually included.
That's right.
I think what we've seen over the last, in the last 40 years in particular, is a new market. And sometimes it gets talked about as private prisons. That's actually not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people like my brother, like my father, a lot of the women in my community that end up going to jail and be a new market for a new type of system, industry, which is the criminal justice system. And that industry looking like being able to pay, the more prisoners, the more a DA is necessary, a more sheriff is necessary, a more COs, prison guards are necessary, the more police are necessary. And that this is happening, and at the same time, we are not providing people access to healthy food. We have totally stopped providing people housing. We have stopped providing people adequate public education. And so something has to give, right? This doesn't happen and then other places improve for poor and Black people. In fact, it's the opposite. And I think that's the visceral impact this chart has for me, is remembering that in this moment, whole Black communities are completely divested from. And the only thing we're offered is criminalization.
Professor Davis, you've asked us to imagine a world where these don't exist at all. What does that look like?
I think the chart is an indication of the fact that that as a result of particular socioeconomic, historical conditions, given the role that racism plays and has played in our world, it is possible for such a phenomenon to take place. And I'm looking at it and I'm remembering, I got involved in movements around political prisoners and movements to transform the punishment system in the 1960s.
Right when it's done.
So you see where we are in the 1960s? 200,000 people in federal state prisons, some more in jails. And we thought that was an enormous number of people behind bars. And I've said many times, we evoked this gigantic number of people who were being held behind bars. And then you see what happens in the 1980s. And what's going on in the 1980s? Well,
and then Bill Clinton.
It's a kind of new historical conjuncture. And Patrisse has already evoked capitalism and learning what it means to live, to inhabit a community shaped by capitalism. Well, during the 1980s, capitalism began to transform. Global capitalism, globalization, deindustrialization, large numbers of corporations migrating, immigrant corporations. Right? I think it's really important that when corporations migrate, that's good.
That's right.
But when human
but not
beings
people.
migrate, they're considered illegal. And so combined with the situation that resulted from the basically whatever welfare state we had before being destroyed. That is to say, no more access to health care, no more jobs because the corporations are gone.
Exactly.
The auto industry is gone. The steel industry is gone. Schools are becoming increasingly privatized, no access to education. And then, of course, beginning in the 1980s, you see a massive buildup in the prison population and the construction of prisons all over the United States, which then made prisons profitable.
Exactly. That's right.
And then gave the corporations a stake in the continuation of the existence of these places of mass incarceration. And who were the first ones to suffer? Well, capitalism, we really should always be talking about racial capitalism. We should remind ourselves that capitalism has always thrived on racism, from the era of slavery to the present. And so that's one of the questions we need to be asking. That's one of the questions that rarely gets asked. So it means that we need to ask questions about perhaps a more revolutionary approach these days, a more radical approach, but we really need a revolution. We really need a revolution. We need a revolution. And I don't have to tell you that.
You sure don't.
So we're standing here looking at the chart.
Yeah.
Right? The big historical sweep, right? So yes, Reagan, but also Clinton. And only down just a little touch for President Obama, who does bring it down, right? But not, I mean, again, to point out that you begin in the 1960s and then, right? So that's here. Now I want to come down to the little girl part that you do, right? Because they're working together.
Yeah.
So you asked that question about prisons, but then you also asked this question. What does the shattered heart of a Black girl look like? And you were asking that in the context of your father being incarcerated. But when I read it, the first image that came to mind for me is this one. It's the image of Emmett Till's mother standing over his open casket. So when you say, what does the shattered heart of a Black girl look like? She is not a girl, she is a woman. She's one of the most courageous women in world history.
Yes.
Can we talk about Trayvon?
Yeah. You know, I learned about Trayvon because I read a blog, a really small blog on social media, and I was incredibly disturbed that I didn't hear it on mainstream media. I happened upon this blog, and it had a little small section that a young boy named Trayvon Martin was killed by, at that point, white man. We didn't know that George Zimmerman was white passing and was half Latino. And so I remember going on social media, because that's where our generation does all our venting, for better or worse. And I went on social media. I was like, has anybody heard about this? This is crazy. Like, what are we doing about it? And I brought folks actually to come gather at my house to just process. I do a lot of that. Like, let's just come talk about this incident. And then I would follow it, right? Obviously, the role of Sabrina and Tracy, Trayvon Martin's parents, they push for George Zimmerman to get arrested. They push for a public dialogue. Obviously, Reverend Al Sharpton is supporting them and really being a backdrop and getting NAN to be an action around that. And then I see Sabrina on a stage in New York City at a huge protest about Trayvon and George Zimmerman. And then George Zimmerman does get arrested and he goes to trial. And in that year, every generation has their racially charged trial. this is ours. And I was naive. I really thought George Zimmerman...
This was the first of yours.
This was the first of ours, yes, right. There's multiple. I thought that he was gonna get manslaughter. Just was like he killed the boy, like we know that's a fact, right? That wasn't up for debate. But clearly stand your ground becomes that sort of centerpiece in the conversation. And then on July 13, 2013, I was in Susanville, California, in a little small prison town, visiting one of my mentees, came back from my visit, went onto social media to see the verdict, and it was not guilty. And I think a lot of things happened. And I think it's complicated when you're an abolitionist, when someone doesn't go to jail that you think deserves some sort of, the family deserves justice. But I knew that it was a betrayal. This wasn't just about George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin. This was a history of white violence against Black bodies going without any accountability. And so I went online again. And I was venting and raging and trying to figure out what I was going to do in a small prison town because I knew I couldn't protest there. And I went onto Alicia Garza's page, and I'd known Alicia for a long time. And she wrote a love note to Black folks, and in that love note she wrote Black Lives Matter, and I put a hashtag on it. And it was those moments were so organic. There was no sitting around a table strategizing. It was like, we just gotta move. I couldn't imagine that George Zimmerman would be the period to the story. There had to be something else. And within the next 48 hours, Alicia and myself and Opal were like, we're building a political project. And we want to have a courageous conversation about anti-Black racism. And we actually want to challenge this idea because this was the idea that was happening at this moment, which was we were in a post-racial society because we had a Black president. And it meant that we had overcome racism. And obviously, Trayvon becomes an intervention, and Black Lives Matter really propels a new conversation around, all right, y'all, let's have the conversation that we often don't want to have publicly about how Black people are continuously and systematically targeted for our own demise. And how do we have that conversation in a way that is going to transform the conditions for Black people? And Trayvon really becomes, that moment becomes our moment. It really does.
So I'm looking at Mamie Till and I'm thinking, she allows us to see what white racism does to her child. It launches a movement. We actually don't, it's hard to remember this, but we, for the most part, we're not bombarded with images of Trayvon dead in the way that we are going to be in the years after that. But Professor Davis, I guess the question is, if we can kill the 4 little girls, the 4 young women in Sunday school, if we can kill Emmett, if we can kill Trayvon and then slaughter for the rest of the second term of the first Black president on what feels at a certain point like an almost weekly basis, although now it has stopped completely, we don't see it at all anymore. Then the question is, do Black Lives matter?
Well, first of all, I think the fact that we're going back to Emmett Till is an indication that it didn't start with Trayvon. And it didn't start with Emmett Till. We can trace this kind of racist violence, all the way back to the era of slavery and colonization. Indigenous people were the first targets of that violence. And in a sense, I think by the time the life of Trayvon Martin was taken from him, the cumulative effect of so many years and so many decades, and Emmett Till and Carol Robertson and Denise Wesley and the other girls in the 16th Street Baptist Church, and then Viola Luisa in 1965, who was killed by the Ku Klux Klan, and the SNCC workers, and then we can fast forward to Sean Bell and Amadou Diallo, since we're here in New York. Yep. This has been going on, and it continues to go on, by the way, even though the media may not be.
That's right.
Giving this violence the kind of coverage that it should be getting. But I think that when Trayvon was killed in 2012, it marked a kind of conjuncture, a historical moment when so many people were ready to say, with Patrisse and Opal and Alicia, that we have to create a world in which Black lives do matter. And your brilliance was not so much that of coining a term, of creating a hashtag, but being able to connect with the collective imagination, and recognizing that so many of us were experiencing the same thing. We were saying that this has been going on for years and decades and centuries, and now we have to do something to make sure that we at least start the process of arresting the violence, or at least understand what it is that has given rise to this continual tradition of racist violence. And so that's why, thank you so much. Thank you. And you can say that, political imagination really matters.
It really does.
It really, really matters. And being able to generate an idea that allows huge numbers of people to identify and to imagine themselves as a community ready to move. So thank you.
Thank you, Angela.
So you just did something so important there, Professor Davis. Patrisse, Alicia, Opal. Patrisse, Alicia, Opal. Patrisse, Alicia, Opal. I want to show this image of Ferguson that I think has become the one, at least, of the ones that we think of as central, both to Ferguson and to the movement.
Yeah.
Patrisse, Alicia, Opal, 3 women, queer women, women who exist on the margins even of Black communities. You write about kids being sent away simply for being alive in a place where war had been declared against us. Again, maybe that sounds hyperbolic until you literally see it. But then you also don't allow us to stay in a binary gender, in a heteronormative framework, and you complicate it with how not only is there war declared against Black folks by the state, but often on queer kids by the whole community. And on girls and women by the very men we're organizing around. Patrisse, Alicia, Opal, and yet why does everybody think this movement is just about boys and the police?
A lot of reasons, I think. One of them is because we have in our political imagination what we expect to see when someone is charging forth human rights and civil rights, especially within Black folks, is the Black, cis, heteronormative, Christian, charismatic leader. Very early on, I remember people saying, you know, simply, we need an MLK.
Y'all can't be alone in the room without a grown-up.
Exactly. Lots of sexism, lots of patriarchy, and almost a disappointment that we were women.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you started Black Lives Matter? Question mark? Like, oh, I didn't know it was gonna be you. And
Or the Russians on Facebook.
right?
Sorry.
Oh, tell the truth though. Plot twist. So I think there's this way in which we've challenged that, visually challenged, who's in front, who's on the front lines. But I think we also did something else, which was to remind people that Black women have always been on the front lines. This like odd fantasy and romantic vision of MLK at the mountaintop is exactly that.
Yep.
It is a fantasy. And if we have a real conversation, if we open up, and if we pull back the curtain, what you're gonna see is a bunch of Black women who are the architects, the tacticianers, the strategists, and also made the frickin' coffee and had to feed people, and were holding down a movement. And that we're just part of that legacy. And I think we, you know, the three of us in particular, because we had been in so many rooms, you know, Alicia, Opal, and I, we have been in this movement before Black Lives Matter. And I think people were confused by that too.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, I thought y'all started Black Lives Matter. I'm like, no, we're like trained organizers. Like
Rosa Parks,
exactly.
who wasn't just tired or old.
Exactly.
Hello.
Or Ella Baker.
Hello.
Who was on, you know, those.
Yeah, because Rosa Parks was considered to be this person who happened to be
Just
a
happened to
tired
be.
old Black woman. And she was a trained organizer.
So,
But we just keep giving that story. Yes.
Yes. And so I think this moment also allows for myth busting and allows to reframe even history. And that's what's been powerful for me, is the reframe of history, and also the reckoning around patriarchy and sexism and how it lives in the world, but in our movements.
And may I say something,
Please.
Melissa and Patrisse? We often don't recognize the connections. Connections between movements, and of course now we're experiencing this surge of activism against sexual violence, against sexual harassment. And we tend to think of it as something discrete, something separate from Black Lives Matter.
Thank you, God.
Right?
Yeah.
Thank you, God, for saying that.
I mean, I think it's so important to recognize that this phenomenon of women of all, you know, racial and ethnic backgrounds coming forth to talk about sexual harassment and sexual violence was enabled precisely by previous uprisings and by the fact that it is publicly known that the 21st century Black freedom movement is led by women. Right? is led by women. So let's make those connections and understand the relationships.
Yep. I have a lot of words. I'm going to put them back inside of my face. I will say just one thing, because it just feels so crucial in part because, Professor Davis, when you're like, wait a minute, hold on, I need to have this moment to express your love and appreciation for this young organizer. And to remember that Me Too begins for Tarana Burke as an expression of solidarity across generations of a Black woman with a girl, a recognition of shared trauma. It wasn't, me too, not to say that that's what people are doing, but it wasn't bandwagoning. It was empathy, recognition about shared trauma across generations. And that feels to me like one of the connections I want to note, because I know not always are we good about seeing across generations and acknowledging across them.
Yes, that's right. The blues women in the 1920s.
Okay, putting the words back in my face. Because I don't want us to leave this space without talking about Monty.
Yeah.
Because to insist on acknowledging the leadership of women and queer women is not to push away the extraordinary amount of love that you have for so many different kinds of people in your text. I mean, women and non-binary people and just all the people, but your brother.
Yeah.
Tell us about Monty.
Monty is my first best friend. And honestly, in a lot of ways, the foundation around how I care for people. I learned from my big brother, Monty. And it's when he's older, when he's 18 years old and he ends up in the county jail, and he's, for the first time ever, diagnosed by a psychiatric doctor inside a jail. And with that diagnosis and living inside that jail, it's also one of the first times he's brutally beaten. I mean, he had experienced police brutality and harassment, but almost died at the hands of the police inside of the county jail. And this is after they diagnosed him. And what would happen, at least for the next decade and a half, is my brother going in and out of prisons and jails, all for his mental health. Every moment he's inside is because of he's an episode, the police catch him an episode, and this, my story with my brother really becomes one of the clearest markers for me around why abolition is so important, and why the imagining of something that isn't a cage is so important, and why living in a place like the US that's supposed to be the most sophisticated, the most resource-rich, is unable, literally, to give basic care to someone who is suffering from schizoaffective disorder. And our family, a family that's not trained in psychology, a family that's not trained in how to work with people with severe mental illness, become the frontliners for him. And what a shame. What a shame, because there's so many families that are unable to do that, literally. And I become that person because I'm an organizer. And so that skill of, all right, how do we create a campaign for my brother's health becomes really important for me. But that shouldn't be the burden placed on families. And I talk about it in the book, but I think what I recognize the most with Monty and our relationship is how much is taken from me. It's taken from him, it's taken from my family, and more importantly, my community. Monty is also an amazing jeweler. He's an amazing artist, and was never, the only investment he was given was criminalization, and serious brutality, and I argue torture.
We're going to go to questions, but I want to show one last image and ask one last question as we go to audience questions, because part of the Monty story is also that he is labeled a terrorist.
Yep.
He's actually charged with terrorism. You, of course, and all the members of Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives have at various points been labeled and called a terrorist. And then if we see the image, the wanted poster for Professor Davis. And so I want to ask you this, Professor Davis, as we go to audience questions. The title of Patrisse's book is When They Call You a Terrorist. And so my question is, what happens when they call you a terrorist?
When they call you a terrorist, they criminalize you. They create the conditions for you to be the target. And therefore, they deflect attention from the work that you're trying to do. I think of someone like Patrisse Cullors, who was not long ago labeled one of the 10 most dangerous terrorists in the world.
That's right.
So I think that when we take account of the fact that, to my knowledge, no member of a white supremacist organization, am I right? Is called a terrorist. And we have to learn how to decode these terms. We have to, learn the meaning behind the words that they use. And when I saw that the title of your book was When They Call You a Terrorist, I was very excited about that because you, well, not because I felt included, not because I felt interpolated by the text, but because I knew you were going to do that process of demystification and bring some clarity on the issue.
That's right. So let's go to audience questions, and let's move away from this image because nobody wants to keep looking at that. And we'll just put up this lovely image of Patrisse at work on her art. So we'll have a creative Black girl moment instead.
You're so good.
Alexander from Facebook wants to know, just real quick, how we close the gap between those living in poverty and the elite Black class of the U.S. Okay.
Do you want to answer that?
Well, I guess what I can say is that I don't think we're about closing gaps. I don't even think that our struggle is about inclusion. And that's the term that's used almost inevitably, diversity and inclusion. Oh, Lord. I don't think it's about assimilation. I think it's about revolutionary transformation.
I mean, there's always two ways to close gaps. I mean, you can bring people from the bottom up. You can also take people from top down. But like, I can close the gaps between the rich and the poor fast. Hashtag redistribution. Okay. That's why I ain't got a job. Okay. Erica from Facebook asks, how can we educate communities of color about the importance of mental health?
That's great. It's a great question. I think when I was, social media is such an interesting phenomenon because just 15 years ago it didn't exist. So in a lot of ways, when my brother came home, which is how we found out my brother had a diagnosis, because they brought him home in the middle of an episode and didn't tell us. And so for anybody who has severe mental illness or who has a family member with severe mental illness, when you bring someone home without their medication, that's a very serious problem. And so we had to learn by trial and by fire, but people don't have to. There's an amazing organization called NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness. They do incredible work for families and folks with mental illness. I take a lot of classes there, and they have caucus groups for Black families, other families of color, women. I would just say take advantage of that. It's free. And I think being honest about mental health. You don't have to have severe mental illness. You can suffer from anxiety, PTSD, depression. I know our movement talks about that a lot. We've unfortunately lost a few people to suicide in our movement. And I think the more honest we are about our conditions and what we're experiencing, the better we can be at not necessarily solving the problem, but thinking about it collectively, about how we deal with it, and how we hold space for it. And so I'm a big fan of folks having conversations, getting free counseling and therapy, holding that space for yourself, because just as much as our physical bodies are fragile, so is our mental health.
Yes.
Good evening. Thank you so much. It's an incredible honor to be here and to bear witness to this tonight. And I'm particularly celebrating the intergenerational nature of the platform tonight. I'm going to do a little plug because I've worked with the Office of the Mayor.
I was told specifically not to allow plugging.
Thrive NYC.
Okay.
Thrive NYC, New York City.
Yes.
And I really have to say that as a First Lady has moved to destigmatize mental health in the city.
Great.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about the roles that we can play in support to the different movements. I think of how unfamiliar we were with Black Lives Matter and how, quote unquote, leaders in our society talked about we needed a real leader because we didn't understand the phenomenon of a social, a movement led by social media. And I want to fast forward a bit to a movement that I think that's emerging now on March for Our Lives, which really builds on the young people speaking out. So talk to us about older people as I move the past 50 years. What do we do to be that investment and support for the next generation?
So are you asking the older person? Or the
Patrisse, you should say what you need.
Okay.
What does the movement for Black Lives need?
Well,
from just the whole world of resources.
yeah, I think there's one thing that I want to just engage on is that it's definitely not a movement led by social media. It's a movement that has utilized social media to support it. We couldn't get things done if we just lived on social media. But I think the other thing is showing up to meetings, being present. Black Lives Matter doesn't just protest. We are having meetings. We are communicating with one another, whether it's online, whether it's over the phone, whether it's in person. I think, setting up time to sit and meet with people and ask them directly, I live in this town, what do you need? Black Lives Matter does a lot of work with families who've been impacted by state violence. Those families always need support, always need, just basic things, and I think that's an important place to start as well.
Yes.
Okay. My name is Carl Dix. I know one of you panelists, and I was also in jail in Leavenworth Military Penitentiary when another of the panelists was being sought by the FBI on a nationwide, hunt down. And I just wanted to reference that. I also want to go back to some things that came up at the beginning. We do need a revolution. That is something I've put my whole life into, and I ain't stopping yet. But I want to tie that into what's the situation with that S-hole in the White House, because that's the real shithole right there. And he didn't start none of this stuff. It all came before him, but he's intensifying it, and he is launching an assault on the right to stand up against it. And I think this is a very important thing that we have to look at, because I really agreed that we need to get him out of there, but I don't view that as waiting for the Democrats, because that's still the same system. Yep. And I co-initiated a group called Refuse Fascism that's working to do that. I wanted to pose to the panelists, what about the perspective of calling on millions of people who hate this shit to take to the streets and stay in the streets with a demand that the Trump-Pence regime must go?
So this is a tough question, because this is a duly elected president, as far as we know. I mean, mostly what the Russians did was just get on Facebook and say shit, and people believed it. I mean, what we don't think is that they like turned back the voting machines in Ohio. That's not the claim that's being made, right? It's about discourse around these divisions. So what do we do relative to Trump, whose inauguration photo I also have, just to get us all real triggered? See how I knew that was going to come up? So what do we do?
You want to take that one?
Well, you know, I think that what is really interesting about this contemporary moment is the way in which movements are, I would say, feminist inflected, a kind of feminist approach. And that includes an understanding of the connections, the intersectionality, the interrelationships, the sort of symbiotic connections between issues. And I say that because I'm thinking right now about the response to the horrendous shooting that happened in Florida. And I'm thinking that for the very first time, the students are standing up and are speaking out. But I mention intersectionality of struggles for a reason, because I think that while we often tend to assume that particular issues and particular struggles have their discrete place and are not connected, it's important to recognize the way in which the gun violence is so connected with racist violence. I mean, who are the targets? Who are the threats? Who does the NRA assume poses a threat to the good people, the good white people of the United States of America? And so I say this in the hopes that the students themselves begin to think about how to make those connections. And then, you know, the mental health question that you pointed out, and people like Trump and the NRA want to say that it's only a question of, as if only a question of mental health were an answer. But the fact that, you know, mental health situations are used, mental health predicaments are used as a justification for torture and violence, as happened with your brother Monty. And of course, Black women who are mentally ill and have encounters with the police. I mean, that's actually a fatal cocktail right there. So I think we have to think in more complicated terms. And I hope the students, sense that this is the moment to make those connections.
I'm gonna come to you. I want to tread lightly here, but there's one other name I want to call in this moment, because the students from Parkland are extraordinary in what they're doing right now in transforming their grief into political action. But if we're going to talk about Trayvon, we can't fail to talk about the Dream Defenders.
Right.
Also, Floridian, also young students who saw one of their peers gunned down and took to the state capitol. And mass media ignored them or defined them as a problem. And to your point, Professor Davis, it is both a question of who we think is the threat and who we think constitutes a victim, and where we think the movement began. I am so proud of these young people from Parkland, but they are walking a path that was laid for them by the Dream Defenders.
By the Dream Defenders, absolutely.
Thank you for saying
And
that.
I'm on the advisory board of the Dream Defenders.
That's why I wanted to call them. I love them very much. I love them. Yes, and you talk about them in the book. Yeah.
Professor Davis, I grew up in the Soviet Union, and in the childhood, you were one of my heroes. And of course, when you were imprisoned, a lot of Soviet children were chanting, "Svobodu Angela Davis," freedom to Angela Davis. I guess my question is, and I know you no longer associate yourself with the Communist Party, but that struggle, in fact, was internationalist. When I read the memoirs of Langston Hughes, I cry. There were a lot of things that were wrong with the Soviet Union, but one thing that I learned as a kid, racism is fucking wrong. And y'all are my brothers and sisters, and I truly mean it. I grew up in a society that condemned racism, even though, again, as I said, there were a lot of things that were wrong. I guess my question is, are there any internationalist, per se, techniques, methods from the past that we can still use, not only to create the global awareness of the struggle that doesn't end, but also how do we reach out to the immigrant communities, even Russian-speaking communities that unfortunately are so prevalent, are so racist on many levels, because all of a sudden when you move here, you become white and you sort of conform yourself to the racist notions that already existed. And this is my question, of course, to both of you, and that's sort of one of my struggles with a lot of my Russian-speaking friends, and I just, I don't know how to start a conversation. Thank you, and really, it's a great honor to be in this room and share the love with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel like you were a plant, because the one question I didn't have an opportunity to ask was about the global connections.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you asked that question, because in this country we often tend to talk about our predicament inside the U.S. Without attending to the fact that we are connected to the global, and that, as a matter of fact, the same kind of police violence that we are addressing here, people are addressing in Europe, in France, in Germany, and especially, given the migrant, the refugee crisis, the so-called crisis in Europe, we should understand the connection with the immigrant rights movement here and the effort to guarantee that that we not only achieve DACA, but we have to get beyond that. That's just the first step. And so, I think this is precisely the moment where we have to make those connections. And Black Lives Matter, I remember seeing a photograph of Patrisse in Palestine. And yes, so applause. And in many ways, absolutely.
Oh my God, yes.
And I think it's important to point out that solidarity with Palestine today is not only important because of what is happening in Palestine, but because Palestine has come to represent global solidarities, come to represent struggles for justice and freedom that are happening all over the world in the same way that South Africa once did. That's right.
I have to bring us to a close. Yeah. I know. Thank God the book is in print. I have to bring us to a close, but I want to finish with your words, Patrisse, because you talked about the myth of the mountaintop. But you do give us an important vision, and I don't want to miss it. I was looking for your vision. You have strategy, you have stories, you have biography, but there's this moment when you're in the 12-step meeting with your father, and you write, "There is something radical and deeply transformational in bearing witness to public accountability before a community gathered for the sake of wholeness." One more time. "There is something radical and deeply transformational in bearing witness to public accountability before a community gathered for the sake of wholeness." And I thought, I'm going to call that my Patrician promised land, this beloved community where that could happen.
Yes.
Thank you for this text. Professor Davis, thank you for your continued intellectual and political and social contributions to the movement. And thank all of you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you, Melissa.